back to Genesis. Seems like we miss a lot of these because of, well, it was Father's Day last week, and then it seems like we have more than one communion service a month nowadays, it seems. I can't believe how long we've been in Genesis. But we're at chapter 25, and we'll get to chapter 26. We do have communion next week. And, as we get into this text tonight, starting at verse 12, is where we are in chapter 25. And here's a kind of an interesting thing. When you look at this, you've heard me say it many times before, but boy, when you read this tonight, you will notice that when God's giving us what is a historical record, He uses some pretty imperfect people. And people tend to be kind of connivers. It's just kind of a human thing. And boy, do you see it in this text tonight. So be reminded of this, that God had said to Abraham that through you the nations would be blessed. You're going to be the father of many nations. And so that doesn't mean that Abraham was perfect, and it certainly does not mean that the rest of them were either. And so what you find is that God uses very imperfect people to bring about what He wants ultimately done. But we also remember that this is the beginning foundation blocks, if you will, of what would be just the Jewish people. So this is the beginning of the covenant. We are talking about the second and now into the third generation, from Abraham to Isaac, and from Isaac to his sons Jacob and Esau. And so, my goodness, when you look at this, you think these are very human people, somewhat ambitious, and you just realize that God does not have perfect people. If you were writing the Bible, again, I've said this a number of times, if you were writing the Bible, you would kind of leave out all the stuff that's not terribly flattering. But at that point, if you were especially looking at the Old Testament, then the Old Testament would probably be about 5 pages long. Because it is filled with some flawed people doing some incredibly flawed things. And we'll find that in the text this evening. So we're going to pick it up at verse 12 of chapter 25. We'll remember something from last week, because now it starts. There's an odd little break in this. What we have in the latter parts of chapter 25 is what happens at the birth of Jacob and Esau. And so by the time we get to chapter 27, we get the rest of the story as it would happen kind of chronologically. Chapter 26, you're going to notice, is just kind of dropped right in the middle of this. And chapter 26 deals with Isaac. And so there's kind of a break, if you will, in the chronology. But it helps us to understand that God's doing these different things. They're not necessarily simultaneous. They're just kind of almost, while that was going on, let me give you some other information that had taken place. And so it's not meant to follow a chronological line necessarily. So chapter 25, we pick up at verse 12. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for gathering us here this evening, and we are grateful for your word. We're thankful that you have given these things to us. You preserved them for us, that we can study history and we can know how things took place in those early years. But at the same time, we can still learn much from this. And we would ask, Lord, that you would help us to have ears that are attentive, that we would be concerned with matters of the truth, and that we would have our lives acting accordingly to what we see here in the text. And so we thank you. We give you praise this evening and ask that you would instruct us by your Spirit. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen? Well, chapter 25, what we got a chance to look at the last time that we were together, we get a little bit of detail about after the passing of Sarah, that Abraham had taken another wife. And so Keturah is mentioned, and then the sons that were born to him from Keturah are given names, but there's no real focus on them. And you'll notice that when the Scripture writes about these things, we'll get the little historical detail, I guess you can say, of the sons of, and that's how the families were known, by the sons. And sometimes, of course, it will mention the ladies as well. But the Bible doesn't spend any time dealing much with those people and what had taken place. It will be a little bit with Esau, and we've had little bits and pieces of Ishmael and those kind of things, but that is not God's focus. And the reason it's not His focus is because they're not the covenant people. And so that's what we get as we look through the history of this. And so it picks up with that at verse 12. It does tell us a little bit about Ishmael, but you'll notice not much is said. And it tells us, now this is the genealogy, and that is Toledoth, and that's the generations. You find that from the beginnings of Genesis, whenever God is going to say, and here are the generations, or here's how, if you will, the custody of the names or the families, that's how they continued on. And so this is the genealogy or the history, the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, or through Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maidservants, bore to Abraham. And these were the names of the sons of Ishmael by their names according to their generations. And the firstborn of Ishmael was, and again, I'm not going to try doing these names. They're difficult. Well, so it gives us these groups, and verse 16 tells us, or these men, gives us their names. And it says, now these were the sons of Ishmael, and they were, this were their names, by their towns and their settlements, 12 princes according to their nations. Now this is typical that they would kind of tell you their names, but also, and this is the area where they settled. Now it would mean a whole lot more to those people at the time as they would read this. Verse 17, these were the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. And they dwelt from Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt, as you go towards Assyria, and he died in the presence of his brethren. Now, what this does is it covers pretty much the whole run of the north to the south that is east of Israel. So if you look at Israel and you see how it comes down this way, then there is all the stuff that is kind of Jordan, and then on the other side of Israel is where Egypt is. So that's towards the south, and then it runs all the way up to the north. So in the times that we get in the Old Testament, when we find the problems where nations would be coming from the east, or the people that live just to the east of Israel, you think of Moab, and you think of Edom, you think of Ammon, and those, you hear them always having problems with that. That was kind of in a descending order. The top would be Ammon, the middle would be Moab, and then Edom would be at the bottom. And we'll talk about that as this history goes on. But here's what's interesting. These people who were going to, at various times through the history, be very adversarial towards Israel, would be people that wouldn't have existed if everything had been done in accordance with what God wanted to have done, if it had been done correctly. Now, what we're going to see from this, the two sons, Jacob and Esau, Esau is going to be ahead of a group of people that will be somewhat adversarial. And then we know because of Ishmael that he shouldn't really have been born. And the reason for that was that they took matters into their own hands. Abraham and Sarah, when they were told you're going to have a son, and they thought, well, this is impossible because we can't physically do this. And then we know the thing with Hagar and Ishmael and all the mess that ensues to this day because of that bad decision of not asking God for more specific information. When God said you're going to have a son, they could have avoided the whole problem by saying, okay, is he going to be from us, or should there be some other way to bring this about? If they did just ask that question, all of it could have been avoided. Well, that ship sailed, so here we are. All right, so it gives us a little bit of detail on the sons of Ishmael. And then notice it moves right on. Now it says in verse 19, now this is the genealogy of Isaac. And you'll notice this begins the process of telling us a great deal of information. And of course, because this is the son of the promise. Now, it tells us Abraham's son, this is the, I'm sorry, let me say it again. From verse 19. This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. And Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah his wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, and the Syrian. Now, we looked at this the last time that we were together, how a wife was sought for him, brought from a long distance away. We remember all that. They wanted to make sure that she was from the same family as Abraham. Well, Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If all is well, then why am I like this?" And so she went to inquire of the Lord. So a kind of a difficult pregnancy is obviously the case here, but what's kind of funny about it when you start to see that it's not just a difficult pregnancy, but these twins are fighting. And so it's a, if you will, kind of a harbinger of what is to come. And you'll find that even in their birth, that there is something that is quite reminiscent of what's going to be the rest of their life. And so rather than go to the doctor, she goes to the Lord. Why do I feel so horrendous? Why do I feel like this? Well, can you imagine getting this information from the Lord? Lord, I don't understand. Why do I not feel so well in this pregnancy? And then God says, well, there are two nations in your womb. Oh, great. Well, let's hear some details about that. Well, two nations are in your womb. Two peoples will be separated from your body. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So the battle's already happening, right? They aren't even born yet, and it's being fought out in the womb. And so God is explaining the turmoil and the trouble that you're feeling now. Hey, it's just the beginning. Now, what you're going to notice, again, this is now the third time that we will see in Genesis where there is a problem between brothers, and the older, as you know, being the one who has the problem with the younger. And so we think Cain and Abel, of course. Now here in this case we have these two brothers, and it's not at all kind of an unusual thing, but now we are getting to the place of birthright. Now it's going to be the matter of who's going to receive the blessing. It's always the firstborn. Well, look at what she does as far as getting names for these two. Well, so when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed, there were twins in her womb, and the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over, so she called his name Esau, which basically means hairy, rough. Rough, hairy, whatever you want to call him. But he was different in his appearance. Now, it says, afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and so she called his name Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Now, Jacob means basically heel catcher, or one who sets snares, a supplanter. Now, that's what Esau is going to call him later. So can you imagine, ladies, if you've ever had children, can you imagine having twins, and the whole time while you're pregnant with them, they're like quarreling all the time, and it even happens as they're born, that as the one is born, the other one's got him by the heel. Now, of course, I think that this was all done, and yeah, do I believe that God had it happen so because it was going to be a reminder of what would be the rest of their lives, and really for generations after? Do I really believe that when Esau was born that he was hairy? Yes, I do. Do I believe that shortly after he had exited the womb that even his brother still had hold of his ankle? Yeah, I believe that. And I believe it for the very simple reason that the Word says so, but it's also borne out. Now, did God cause those things to happen? Perhaps. However it is, this is what was seen. And so the names of the children, when you look up the names of pretty much it was the way that people would name their kids. It wasn't just, ooh, that sounds cool, but oftentimes their kids would be named by the events taking place. So both of these guys had the perfect name, and it's going to be an issue that we will see into chapter 27. And even the intrigues of how they interact one with another, even in their early years, it will certainly be the focal point of chapter 27. If we get, we won't be able to get all the way through that because it really does need to kind of stand on its own. Now, in verse 27, we find out little bits and pieces about these two. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man dwelling in tents. Now, some people would look at that and say, Jacob is the more noble of the two, and he was more caring about the things of God. Hey, he's called heel catcher. He's called supplanter. He's the one who lays snares. And he's a bit of a conniver. There's no question about it, because he wants to rip off his brother's birthright because he sees that I really want that. And he's mom's favorite, whereas Esau is dad's favorite. Okay, well, we find out that this is not starting off well, and it's going to tell you how it's going to continue to go on. So notice verse 28, Isaac loved Esau, and here's why. Because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. That's not a good reason. Son, I love you best because you're a better hunter and I like the food that you make. That's not a good reason to love your kid. And Mom, don't love your kid just because he's better in the kitchen, or they'd rather be around the house. Well, that kind of seems to be a bit of it. It doesn't tell us why. But it also does tell you that even in the house, to some extent, there was some favoritism, and there was a little, if you will, would even say some dysfunction. Well, it says, so Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, please feed me with some of that, with that red stew, for I am weary. Therefore his name was called Edom. Now, so again, yeah, the Edomites, red is what it means. That's the literal of it. But from that time on, there was a name change with him too, and there was going to be a name change of Jacob as well as time will go on. We'll get there eventually. But if you understand the original language in this, this is pretty funny. Because Esau comes in and it's all drama. I'm about to starve to death. So give me some of that you're making, that I just want to gobble it down. It wasn't like I want to sit down and have a fine dining experience. He goes, basically, let me just kind of bury my face in that food. I'm going to die if I don't eat something, right? So that kind of, whatever. Well, here's Jacob. Now, you kind of look at it like this. If your brother's the great hunter and all the rest of that, then he's in that place making demands. Well, Jacob at this point is really kind of in the driver's seat with this. Oh, really? You're going to starve to death? All right. Well, this lentil soup is going to cost you. So he says to him, so Esau said, please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary. Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, well, sell me your birthright as of this day. And Esau said, look, I am about to die, so what is my birthright to me? What do I care? Now, he's going to find out that that was a very bad wager, and yet he could go ahead and swear pretty much whatever he wants to. By the time he gets around to chapter 27, he doesn't even care that he has made this deal. He still thinks he's entitled to this. Now, here's the important part. When you look at this in two bits and pieces, the birthright always came to the firstborn, and he was given the double portion of things. And then the rest of the heirs, of course, they would get their things, but the firstborn always got the best. Now, when Jacob makes this request and says, sell me your birthright, how much is this food worth to you? Are you really going to die? If so, let me have your birthright, and I'll give you some of this. Well, in the back of his mind, does Esau think, Dad will never give it to him anyway, whatever. Have my birthright. Well, so he sells it for that. So Jacob says, sell me your birthright as of this day. And Esau said, look, I'm about to die, so what is my birthright to me? What good is a birthright if I'm dead? Right? Verse 33. Then Jacob said, swear to me as of this day. So he swore to him, and he sold the birthright to Jacob. Now, wouldn't it be funny if you're Jacob to say, I thought you were the mighty hunter, bro. But you need me to give you some of my porridge. Things weren't so good in the field today, huh? Well, it doesn't do all that, just like, hey, if you're that hungry, the cost is your birthright. And he says, sure, whatever. So Jacob gave Esau bread and a stew of lentils, and he ate and he drank, arose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. He didn't see it as an important thing. It didn't matter to him. Now, here is where it becomes kind of an interesting thing. If you were to ask God before this whole thing, God, you want Abraham to be the man that you're going to do this work through. He's going to be the beginning of your nation. But he's going to do all kinds of goofy things. He's going to lie to people because he's fearful of his own life. And he's going to do this, that, and the other thing. Do you still want to use him? God would be able to say, I knew all of that going in. But I knew that he would also be faithful to the important things. Now, from that point on, well, Esau is the firstborn, but is he really the man that you want to use? Well, God would say, it's not, the way that they were born and all the rest of it. Would this be God's ideal thing, that Jacob would be a bit of a conniver? and find a way to kind of rip off his brother of the birthright, and then his mom becomes complicit in it by deceiving the father? Would God do such things this way? No. That's not the way he would do it, but he uses very imperfect people. And the things that they do in their imperfection are still going to bring about what he wants done. So the line was going to come through Jacob, not because he was perfect, but because he was that son. Now you'll also notice from this time, though there were a multitude of sons, you're going to notice that to this point, this is the last of the time that the focus is on any one particular son. Abraham to Isaac, and not Ishmael, or the other sons of Keturah, or any of the rest of that. It isn't focused on any of them. Isaac, and then it is to Jacob and Esau. Esau becomes kind of an inconvenient casualty of all of this. The focus becomes Jacob. And so then from Jacob, we are going to have a split at this point of not just one son, but now a multitude, because the 12 tribes come from Jacob's sons. So as we get into that, you'll notice that it begins to broaden up. And at that point, as they're going to be coming back into the land, hundreds of years down the road after Moses coming in with Joshua, they're going to start to parcel up the lands based upon these tribes that came from Jacob's time. Now, there are a lot of parallels that you'll notice from Abraham's time. There will be a lot of parallels that you will also notice of various things that had taken place in their history that seem to repeat themselves. And it'll be kind of an off and on discussion that we'll have in the chapters coming up. Chapter 26 begins that whole, an example of one of those things. Well, here it is in verse 1 actually. So there was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham, and Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, at Gerar. Now, here's the thing that's kind of important, because we see Abimelech, and we think that's a proper name for it, and it can be, and it would be a succession of lines, because there was an Abimelech in Abraham's time. Now, this same Abimelech is probably not the same guy. Is he a son of or a grandson of that Abimelech? Is it a family name, or is it more of a title like we would think Herod? So there were the Herods, right? And then there were the different groups in that line of Herod. So it could be any of the above. It could be either one. Could be proper name, could be title, whatever. Different guy, though. And so as we go through it, you'll kind of see that, because we're talking about generations, a very, very long time. So at this point, it says... well, let me stop for just a moment. You're going to notice some very, very important similarities, it would seem like. But it has caused some who take a low view of the Scripture that what we have in chapter 26 is confusion on the behalf of the person who's writing, because, well, this is the same famine that was talked about with Abraham back in chapter 12. And so this interaction with Abimelech, it's all the same stuff from Abraham's time. It's just sloppy history. Verse 1 settles that. This is not the famine of Abraham's time. This is a different one. Notice how it says that right there in verse 1. There was a famine in the land besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham, and Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. Now it says, so the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt, but live in the land where I will show you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For you and your descendants I give these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. So it would give the impression that whatever this famine was, he was the first one to go at the beginnings of it, seemingly, because nobody else seems to travel with him. But he goes and he heads towards the coast where this Abimelech would be. And it seems like he has eyes on going down to Egypt, like Abraham had done before. Let's stop for a moment. Because it would appear as though what Isaac is doing here is thinking, okay, I know what my dad did in times like this. I have a little bit of history here. Maybe it would be a smart thing for me to retrace, if you will, his steps. Sometimes that's not a bad thing, and then other times it might not be the best thing. Just relying on what has happened in the past. I'm going to point that out a few times as we go through this, but keep that in mind as we go through this particular part of the text. So he goes towards the west, and he sees Abimelech, and he's in those lands. Now there was a a good, healthy relationship, but there was also, they recognized in Abraham's time that God was with Abraham. Now these same people, the same groups of people, are seeing the same favor that Isaac has here. And so God says to him, stay here, don't go any further. I don't want you going as far as Egypt like your father did. Now he says in verse 4, as he continues this promise, and I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. He wasn't perfect, but he was obedient. Now, here's an interesting thing. When you look at the whole history of things, by the time that Jacob rolls around, we get a lot about Jacob. We're going to hear a ton of history about him and his sons. We know a lot about Abraham because we've had a ton of his history. But as far as this is concerned, Isaac's history is kind of sketchy. It's not sketchy in the way that he was some troublesome guy, but we don't get a lot of detail. It's led some people to say, well, he wasn't really necessarily of the same mold, if you will, that maybe Jacob was, especially in his later years. In his early years, the guy was kind of, again, a conniver. When you think about Abraham, the father of the faith, and yet when it comes to Isaac, there was that big deal where he was obedient with his father. He was going to be sacrificed. But think of how little we hear about him after that episode. Decades, really, before really much is said of him. Well, so it says, notice he says, I'm going to make good on the promise that I had given to your father. And even the land that you're going to have to go and kind of entreat the king that's there and seek him out, really ultimately it's a land that I've given to you anyway. And yet, as we see, Abraham lived as a sojourner even in the land that God had given to him. Kind of an interesting thing. Yeah, you've been given all of this land, but they didn't look to go and conquer it necessarily. Interesting about that. One other little thing. Let me mention it before we move on. There are those people that love to point to the Old Testament and say, yeah, well, that Old Testament God was always killing people, always doing this, that, and the other thing. But you'll notice, interestingly enough, that Abraham was not a warlike guy, nor was Isaac, nor was Jacob. These guys were just not going and conquering and plundering and all the rest of it. Those things began to take place when the nations would rise up against them and become warlike. And then it was a matter of God saying, for preservation's sake, war is what's going to take place because there's a promise that's been made. You have to be the inhabitants of this land. And so that really began to take place after Moses came back into the land. Interesting how that is. So when you talk with people and they say all that stuff about He's just a warlike God and all the rest of that, read the earlier parts of Genesis because you don't see it there. There's always a context for it. There's always a reason why. So this Isaac, interesting guy. So it says, so Isaac dwelt in Gerar. And so the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, she is my sister. Huh. This sounds familiar. Now, where did you learn that? Well, that's what Mom and Dad used to do. Really? How'd that work out for Mom and Dad? Now, let me point out something that I think is hugely important, and it is something that I have learned but not always necessarily practiced. All right? When confronted with situations, before I was saved, I was 20 years old when I got born again, right? Into my about 21st year is when the work that God wanted to do really began to take hold in my life. However, here's one of the most difficult things to do is to unlearn the way that you did things before you were saved. Am I speaking to anyone here? The most difficult thing to do is to try to unlearn all of your bad habits. Or do things that are expedient because they're easy for your flesh. And they don't necessarily make you dependent upon God. You just revert back to your normal state. Anybody else have this problem? Good. I'm glad at least it's not just me. And this is, I've been saved for more years than I wasn't. All right? I finally reached, that's one of those milestone things. Okay, I was this old when I got saved. That means if I double my years, I have to get to this age before I can say I've been born again for more than half of my life. Now, I'm way past that now. So it means that I've really reached perfection, right? Hardly. Still trying to unlearn doing the easy thing. So once again, he's faced with something. And again, where did you learn that? You learned it from your dad and your mom. So dads and moms, let's also pass this along and say, boy, we do not want our kids picking up our bad traits. We want our kids picking up on the successes and our dependence and our faithfulness to God and His promises. That's what we want our kids to learn. Well, here's one of those things that Abraham passed along to Isaac, apparently, because he's... All right. Sorry. I wasn't touching it. All right. Well, did that freak anybody out? It's just the cords down here by my foot. Sorry about that all. All right. So he says, now, the men of this place, they asked about his wife. Hey, look at her. Now it's active here. Okay, give it a try. How's that? That work okay? Great. Man, it's like I couldn't have stood on it. Sorry, yeah, it's a message. Don't use amplification. That's okay, I'm loud. I can get this out. All right, so what we see here. Oh, by the way, edit this part out. There, because we put up all the studies on the website. So it says, the men of the place asked about his wife and said, well, she is my sister, for he was afraid to say that she is my wife. Why? Because he thought, lest the men of the place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold. Boy, this is carbon copy of Abraham and Sarah. Now, again, some people would look at this and say, see, they're just mixing up the history. This is the same history. They just were not very careful. No, no, no. I believe that this is put there for this very reason, to tell us, be careful how it is that you parent, because your kids are going to pick up on what you do. Good or bad. Well, this is not very favorable. And once again, let me remind you, as I started this thing out, the Bible will so often record for us everything that happened, whether it is favorable or unfavorable, so that we could learn the lessons from failure and from success. And God is not trying to put forth a narrative here that His people were perfect. He's putting forth the narrative that they were very much human. And look, if I'm thinking that my actions could get me killed, yeah, there is a real incentive for me to maybe come up with some reason. But if you have the history that God is always good on preserving you, why would you rely on your flesh? It's a great question, and you see it played out constantly in these passages. Well, verse 8, so it came to pass, when he had been there for a long time, that Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, looked through a window. So they'd been there for a while. This has been going on. So he looks through a window, and he saw, and there was Isaac showing endearment to Rebekah, his wife. Now, whatever that means, however it was that he saw it, he noticed that what they were engaging with was not brother and sister stuff. It was marital stuff. Now, it was just, was he embracing her? Was it a kiss? Who knows? No reason to speculate. But it was enough for Abimelech to say, that is not brother and sister. So, it says, Abimelech brings him in and wants to know what's going on. So he called for Isaac and he said, quite obviously, she is your wife. So how could you say she is my sister? And Isaac said, because I said, lest I die on account of her. And Abimelech said, what is this that you have done to us? One of the people might soon have laid with her, with your wife, and then you would have brought guilt upon us. Now again, it's kind of one of those things. Who do you think we are? We may not be like you necessarily in all the belief, but give us some credit here. You have put yourself, for your own reasons of preservation, you made it seem as though she would be available because she's not your wife, she's your sister, not traveling with her husband. And now you put everybody here in jeopardy. Now, what he knows, this Abimelech, whatever their relationship was, he knows that Isaac is the son of Abraham. They would know of one another, and they would know that God has really created a problem for this nation before because of the last time something like this happened. And so, once again, you weren't up front with us. Now you've potentially put us in a pretty messed up place. Why would you do this? And again, he says, self-preservation. Okay. Well, so Abimelech, he says in verse 11, Abimelech charged all of the people, saying, "He who touches this man or his wife will surely be put to death." Now, he could have done that right from the beginning. If he'd have showed up with his wife and said, "Hey, there's a famine in our area. Your relationship with maybe it was your father, your grandfather, and my dad, we all know what the relationship was. I'm coming to you because there's famine in my land. My wife and I are here. Would you show us the same favor that you showed my father?" If he'd have done that, that would have been dependent upon the Lord. And it wouldn't have been a bad witness. Let's face it, this whole thing to Abimelech, what a bad witness that is. Hey, you're a liar just like your old man. Yikes. No, that obviously, he would have learned it from someone. Well, here it is. Well, as we go on, verse 13. So the man began to prosper, and he continued prospering until he became very prosperous. So once again, here's the question. Does God only prosper the righteous? Not necessarily. Why did he do this? Well, because he made a promise to Abraham. And let's also remember, this is the history of the nation. If this doesn't happen with Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to the sons and to all the rest, we don't get a Judah. And if we don't get a Judah, we don't get a Messiah. If we don't get a Messiah, we don't have salvation. If we don't have salvation, there is no hope of eternity. You get it? There is a reason why. And so using even the imperfect to bring about the perfect is what God does. He doesn't have a stable of perfect people. He has people that will make all of their mistakes and yet will be the ones that he uses to bring about what he desires. Pretty interesting how he does that. And I'm reminded of it constantly. And any of you that serve in any kind of ministry, you know this as well. He did not call us because we were perfect. Well, as we read on, so he became very, very prosperous, it says. Verse 14, so he had possessions of flocks, possessions of herds, and great number of servants, and so the Philistines envied him. Now, the Philistines had stopped up all of the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham, his father, and they had filled them with earth. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we are." Isn't this great? Now, here's one of the funny things about it. And I know it drives the world crazy to this day. When you look at the favor that God lavishes upon the Jewish people, it is amazing. Seriously. Start looking at pretty much anywhere where you want to look, all throughout the world, of the people that head up businesses and technologies and all the rest of it. You find Jewish people who are very small compared to the numbers of people that there are in the world, and God is still prospering them to this day. Why? Because he does that with his people. He wants it to be for those who would notice that he is still doing this great work in these people. As we look towards the end of all things, before the Lord's return, we know that he once again turns his attention heavily towards Israel. All things culminate there. It is again one of the reasons why I insist that we go as often as we possibly can. Lately we've been going every year. And as long as there are enough people who want to go, it has a life-changing effect on those who are there, because you cannot help but notice that God is once again prospering them. But let's also remember this. They have been the focus of extermination through the ages countless times. They were displaced from the land for 1900 years, only to be brought back, and they're there now. And this, though it is a Jewish history, is also a history that without it, there would not be a Christian church. Because there would be no Christ, no Messiah, no Jesus without the nation. Are they perfect? We're reading about it right here. It's not as though they got their act together in the next generation. They are still humans who make the same mistakes, but they are the covenant people that God had established. Not because of them, but because of him. Keep all of that in mind as you read this. So he says, all right, you've been here long enough. You're mightier than we are. Get out. So he's closer to the coastal, all right? Now, yeah, these are the same Philistines that were going to be a problem during the times of the kings, all right? So what has to happen from this point? Abraham needs to have Isaac, which has happened now. Isaac needs to have Jacob, which has taken place. And now Jacob is, as we get into the later chapters, is going to have sons, only to have a time when they're going to need to go back down to Egypt, which will turn into a servitude or a slavery that will last for 400 plus years, only to be brought back into the land and repopulated from the time of Joshua after Moses, to repopulate the land by the tribal allotments. And in time, they will come to a place of having the kings. And then the Philistines are going to be back in this whole, episode. So yeah, same groups of people, but notice hundreds of years will transpire and so much will take place only to be back to the same group. Well, here we go. Verse 17. So Isaac departed from there, pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar, and he dwelt there. So he's starting to move back a bit towards the east. And so it says, so Isaac dug wells of water, and that they had dug in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham, and he called them by the names which his father had called them. So he knew where they were, was able to go back and redig them. Now, of course, if you have livestock and you have people and everything else, you have to have sources of water. What had happened after Abraham's death, there wasn't that same expansion that there was in Abraham's time. So if you're a Philistine, you don't want people moving into the land and you don't need the well yet, just fill it back in. That keeps people from showing up, or at least making it easy for them, and it keeps people out of your potential land. Well, so he goes back and he starts to open up the wells that had been traditionally open. Verse 19, also Isaac's servants dug in the valley, and they found a well running with running water there. So this is artesian wells, living wells, basically. Water that's underground that they're able to get to. Not just pools of water, but flowing water. Well, it says in verse 20, but the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying that the water is ours, and so he called the name of the well Ezek. Because they had quarreled with him. So it means the well of contention, or the well of dispute. So again, you name everything after what happened there. So they move on. Well, it says, so they dug another well, and they quarreled over that one as well. And so they called the name of that one Sitnah, which means strife. So quarrel, dispute, strife. This is like not really a successful thing. Sure, we hit water, but we've got nothing but trouble. So what they do is they continue to move further and further towards the east, verse 22. And so he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over that one. And so he called its name Rehoboth, and that means wide open spaces, big, open areas. So nobody's going to dispute on this. There's nobody here. It's not going to be a problem. We've now found water, and so the first of the favorable wells. And he says now. He called it Rehoboth because he said, for now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in this land. Now verse 23 says, then he went up from there to Bearsheba. Now Bearsheba is, if you look in your maps, you get an idea how far you've moved away from the coastland. And so you're kind of in the south. When we go to Israel, we do visit Beersheba. It's one of the places that we go to, and not every tour goes that far south, but it is also an important thing for a few different reasons. We will mention this when we're actually there, because this is the place where this well was. It's also, they named it Beersheba because of the oath that was taken between the first Abimelech and Abraham. And it was the well of the oath, or the well of the seven. Remember, there were 7 goats that were given as a part of it? Well, when you're in Beersheba, you're at what was kind of the most southern portion of what were the territories. There was more land to the south, but Beersheba was kind of like the last in the southern direction of the major places where they would have lived. So Abraham and Isaac and the descendants, this was a place that they were known to be. So we do stop by there. And we also like to be able to say, because you'll notice in the Bible it's often said, and they went from Dan, they went as far north as Dan and as far south as Beersheba, or Dan to Beersheba. So that gives you an idea of the scope from top to bottom of the length or the size of the nation as far as settlements were concerned. So Beersheba is the place that he moves as he goes towards the east, your perspective. As he goes that way, he gets back to kind of where it all began. So he winds up there. And then in verse 24, and so the Lord appeared to him that same night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you. I will multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. Now some people look at that and say, is that because all of this is because of Abraham and not because Isaac had really necessarily, with the same fervency, carried on what Abraham did? Or is this just a way of looking back and saying, no. You're a continuation of the oath that I made to your father, and I will continue it through the rest. Well, however you want to work this out, the bottom line is that this is that continuation. Whatever, for better or for worse, Isaac was definitely in that line of succession, but God here once again tells him, I'm going to continue this work through you. And so he built an altar there, and he called on the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants also dug a well. Here's one of the interesting things. You take to this point in his life before you come to find out that he really becomes focused on the things of God. Up to this point, there hasn't been a mention of that. Now, I want to be careful with this and not say that he didn't care about such things up to this point. We just don't have the history of it. But to me, it is kind of an interesting omission, because we know so much, again, about Abraham. We will know so much about Jacob, because so much of the history is going to be focused on them as we continue to move through Genesis. But not much here. So however we got to this point, the cool thing about it is that God comes and visits him, reestablishes and says, things are going to continue. I'll do this work through you for the sake of your father. And his reply was to build an altar. And he offers to God there. It's a good thing. Well, verse 26 comes around. Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, one of his friends, and Phicol, the commander of his army. Now this Phicol guy, again, is it a title or is it a family name? Because there was an Abimelech and a Phicol in the time of Abraham. So chapter 20 basically. You'll find those same names. So the question once again, is it just these are two people that carry on the same family names, or are these actual titles for whatever positions they held? Hard to say, doesn't really matter, but let's make sure that we don't get stuck in the trap saying since the names are the same, it's just the same story being told with different people's names and it's a confusion of history. It's not the case at all, because you notice that he comes to him for a different reason and at a different time. So Abimelech comes with these guys, verse 27, and Isaac said to him, so why have you come to me, since you hate me and since you have sent me away from you? Now, that's a bit of a stretch, because let's again remember, because it was Isaac who was being dishonest with Abimelech. He didn't come to him and say, hey, my wife and I are here because there's a famine. Would you just show us protection? Instead he says, yeah, well, me and my sister were trying to get away from things. Well, he comes into the land, God prospers him immensely to the point where it's starting to encroach, or actually they're feeling potentially threatened because of who this guy is, and he's starting to get all of the things. And so you're mightier than we are, so go away. Nothing about hatred. So he just kind of maybe overplays it a bit. Well, we see in verse 28, but they said, we have certainly seen that the Lord is with you, and so we said, let there be an oath with us, let there now be an oath between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, since we have not touched you, and since we have done nothing to you but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord. And so he made them a feast, and they ate and they drank. So, again, agreeable. Good. This is the way that it's supposed to be. No war, no tension, no nothing. Now, again, Isaac should be able to look at this and say, and he does, he said, yeah, you're right. You've done those things. And he has to own up to the fact that he came under wrong pretenses the first time. There was definitely a need, but he wasn't being totally honest. Now, Abimelech is saying, we could have done a whole bunch of different things to you back then. We didn't. But now we see that everything is prospering in your hand, and what we're just hoping is that you won't see it as an opportunity to come and take. Now, let's stop for a moment. That land is already his, right? That was promised to his father. The land where Abimelech and the Philistines are, it's not their land. Let's remember that even in our modern day. It's a very important thing, because there is all this discussion about land. And I just have to chuckle. Every single administration that comes into office wants to get involved in the Israeli-Palestinian thing, right? It's all that you end up hearing about. And it's always about dividing land and all the rest. Here's a very interesting thing. When you consider where Abimelech and those guys were, it's kind of around the area that we call the Gaza Strip. Huh. Interesting. Even that little bit that Israel has given back over belongs to them. Look at the original borders. You really want to have a good laugh of what God had offered to Abraham? You will take a little portion of Turkey, a very large portion of Syria, all the way down into Saudi Arabia, and a good portion of the whole western or the eastern portion of Egypt. So you have from the Euphrates to the Nile. and then over across, and you look at the headwaters of the Euphrates is up in where Turkey meets Syria. That's what God promised to Abraham. Not my decision. That's what God said. So when I hear this little squabbling about little strips of land in the, quote, West Bank or in Gaza, I just chuckle and think, man, if you want to talk about original borders, let's talk. Interesting. Well, you guys don't find that as humorous as I do. Verse 31, so they arose early in the morning, and they swore an oath with one another, and Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. So again, point to these kind of things. If you have those friends, oh, God's a God of war and all the rest of that. Really? Right here, they had a chance to do it. When Abimelech sent him away, you're mightier than we are. No, I'm staying right here, and if you don't like it, we'll go to war. He didn't do that. He just said, look, peace, fine. We'll move back towards the east. And there were quarrels between the people, not even between Isaac and Abimelech, but just between the people. And they kept moving east. Let's not quarrel. Let them have their wells. We'll keep going. And finally they get to the place where there wasn't a problem. And then they wind up at Bearsheba. And again, prosperous. So that Abimelech comes all the way from where he is to say to them, let there be peace between us. We notice that God's prospering, and we want to make sure, as we've dealt well with you, deal well with us. Let there be a pact between us. And it happens at Beersheba. What a cool thing that is, because that's exactly the same place where the first Abimelech and Isaac's father Abraham struck a similar kind of a thing. An oath was taken. Pretty neat. So verse 32, it came to pass in that day that Isaac's servants came and told him about the well which they had dug, and they said to him, we have found water, and so he called it Sheba. Therefore the name of the city is Beersheba. And again, it's the well of the oath. And so they had remembered that God once again showed them favor. It's redigging, if you will, the well that was there from that time, and it was a remembrance of what God had done to that point and bringing them back to the same place. Now, verse 34 kind of almost, verse 34 and 35 kind of works more into chapter 27. So it says, when Esau was 40 years old, he took as wives Judith, the daughter of Beri, the Hittite, and Basemeth, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite, and they were a grief of the mind of Isaac and Rebekah. So this was once again marrying outside, and what was going to happen from that point? Once again, this was a troublesome thing. Now, you'll notice that what is just said there seems to fit chronologically at a little bit of a different time, because chapter 27 starts to explain a little bit more about that. Now, this idea that Esau was a bit of a grief, what would be the future of that? I'm trying to rush too much. Let me slow down real quick. Chapter 27 is really the end of Isaac's life. And it shows the problems that was prophesied all the way back to Rebekah. The younger will serve the greater. We know that the first part of that happened when the birthright was sold for porridge. Wouldn't have necessarily meant as much as they might have thought at the time, because it was really going to ultimately come down to who it was that was ultimately blessed by Isaac. Who is he going to pass the blessing on to? By right, it is Esau. But he's not going to receive it. He's already given it away, but that is not for him to either give away or lay claim. It's going to come through the Father and who it is that he ultimately blesses. But there was already troublesome problems that had happened with Isaac and with Rebekah because of their son and this marriage and all the rest that takes place. So as we get to chapter 27, once we start it, we really kind of need to see it to its end, and there's no way to do it in basically 5 minutes. But we do get the understanding at chapter 27. Now it came to pass when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim, so that he could not see, that he called Esau his older son and said to him, my son. And he answered, here I am. And then he said, behold, now I am old, and I do not know the day of my death. So once again, isn't this funny? The old man's always still thinking about food. Is that irreverent? I'm sorry, I should be careful. It's still funny to me. Isaac is like, hey man, I'm getting old, and I really love when you go out and catch me something and bring it back and make it for me. It's just my favorite, right? So it's like, of all the things you could be concerned with, hey, before I die, I'd like to just one more time, man. I love that. Now, How many of you around here are foodies? We would consider ourselves foodies. Man, there's that one go-to dish that you just have to have. And I suppose if I'm thinking I could be out of here any day, do I really want to go get some? Yeah, something that I would probably not eat because I'm worried about what my doctor would say. Anyway, so he says, before I die, this is what I want you to do. Now, as we get to this, it won't be next week because we have communion. The following week, when we get back to this, once again, you will find out that God uses very imperfect things. And this is not how he would have wanted it to come out. What we just read is overheard by Rebekah. And she's going to wait for Esau to go outside and leave to go do this. And she's going to do, we've got to do this quick. Jacob, I need you to go get for me some animals. We're going to cook this thing up. I heard what your dad said. We've got to do this fast. It's just conniving. I mean, it is so conniving what they do. And yet, God is going to use it, and it will bring about ultimately his purposes. Here's the important part. I don't believe that God is the author of this. This would not be in his nature to do dishonest things. But he uses all of what they do, and it does bring it about. And again, Jacob will be changed a bit in time, but for the beginning, he's already kind of worked his brother over for the birthright. And now it's about to come to the real important part of it, where they will get Isaac to pass on the blessing that belongs to Esau by birth, but it will be to Jacob because he is that son ultimately of promise. So kind of interesting. Chapter 27 is where we'll pick up the next time. It is in some ways comical and tragic and embarrassing and just like, shudder to think kind of things, all in one chapter. So we'll pick that up in a couple of weeks. Let's stand and we'll close with a worship song and let's pray together. Lord, we thank you once again, the instruction that we can get from your word. Again, we learn so much history as we read through the book of Genesis. There's so much for us to understand here. And so the application to these things is not to just fall back on what is convenient, what is comfortable, and what is easy. Sometimes you ask us to do the more difficult things and not revert back to the way that things were. We pray, Lord, that we would be careful not to just be learners of history, but also ones who could make application to the truth found in that history. We thank you for this evening. We thank you for your Holy Spirit. We thank you for opening our eyes to the truth. We thank you for all these things and give you the glory and honor in Jesus' name.
Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship his holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul. I'll worship your holy name. The sun comes up, it's a new day dawning. It's time to sing your song again. Whatever may pass and whatever lies before me, let me be singing when the evening comes. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship his holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul. I'll worship your holy name. You're rich in love and you're slow to anger. Your name is great and your heart is kind. For all your goodness I will keep on singing. 10,000 reasons for my heart to find. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship his holy name. Sing like never before. before. Oh, my soul, I'll worship your holy name. And on that day when my strength is failing, the end draws near and my time has come, still my soul will sing your praise unending. 10,000 years and then forevermore. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship His holy name and sing like never before. Oh, my soul, I'll worship your holy name. I'll worship your holy name. Yes, I'll worship your holy name. Have a great week, and God bless you as you go.